Hi, good morning, and welcome to the seventh Virtual Town Hall. It's Monday, the 22nd of November, 2021. And today we're talking about liberty to lockdowns, debunking the myths, interrogating the science, and the place of human rights and freedoms post COVID-19. He'll be coming soon. We also have a few panelists in the house. We have Agatha Tuhere, who is a journalist, Kiza Aaron, he's a human rights activist and lawyer, Dr. Caro Atugonza, who is a biomedical scientist and researcher, and of course, Simon Senyonga, who is a lawyer. Thank you again for joining the discussion, and make sure that you comment, make the comments, follow through, give us feedback, and let us know that you are watching this very, very essential conversation that we're going to be having for quite some time until things change. Welcome again.
Thank you.
So, who do I have in the house right now? I have Dr. Carol.
Yes, hello. Hi, Lucy.
Hi. Hi, how are you doing?
I'm great. How are you doing?
I'm good. So you are a biomedical scientist and researcher with a wealth of experience on vaccines, immunology, and extensive research on HIV/AIDS epidemic, right?
Yes.
So you are actually the perfect person on the panel that we need right now concerning this conversation.
Yes, I'll definitely give my opinion, particularly the science bit of it in regard to this talk.
Yes. So we have, I mean, COVID has been raging for the last 2 years or so. And we have gotten to a point where we're asking, are we really following the science? What's going on? We have variants coming out. The Delta variant has been the one that's most prominent and has been raging all over the place. Vaccines are being mandated, and people are being asked that they should vaccinate against this disease. However, there are opposing voices, or rather other voices that are saying, well, it's not really necessary to mandate a vaccine right now, considering that we have a few people that are actually, there's apparently a bracket I found out recently that could be immune to COVID and do not need the vaccine. Children under the age of 11, 12 do not need the COVID vaccine. And then there is the question of natural immunity. Let's get into that, because I feel like we as the public haven't really talked about natural immunity. The science world, the media, no one is talking about natural immunity as an option here. So what's going on, and what is natural immunity, and can we really bank on it?
Thank you very much, Lucy. Carolina Tugonza. I'm a biomedical scientist, and really my research has focused on understanding the host and the pathogen, and how this interaction really either promotes health, or how this interaction promotes disease. So really, most of my research has been looking at the host. In this case, that would be us, you and me, and the pathogen would be a bacteria, and in this case would be a virus. So you asked a very important question about the science. I understand the science has really been downsized in this regard, and we've had, a lot of public talk on the political bit, with the vaccines, and science has really taken a back seat depending on really what more people are broadcasting. And I'm hoping that with this talk today, we'll be able to, to understand a little bit of the science, and to be able to, to explain some of the things that are happening. So you talked about natural immunity. This is a very nice subject that I like, and particularly I've done some bit of immunology. So basically, natural immunity, we are looking at your immune system. In other words, we are trying to see, how does the body fight infection? How does the body fight an attack? And the science is very beautiful. You just give me a few minutes to break it down. So with the science, really, you have two types of your two categories of your immune system. You have something that we call the innate immune system. So this is more like of a general, it is more like the first line of defense. So I would give examples of your natural immunity. It's like your skin. You see, your skin is covered, your flesh, we don't see your flesh. So I mean, your skin is now being a barrier, and that way it is being a form of, it's a first line of defense for your body. Another thing that I'll talk about is we have body fluids. You know, you have tears, you have sweat. So all those different mechanisms would fall under what we are calling the innate immune system. You know, how your body is fighting. Our very first line of defense. So now the body is mounting another important immune response, and this is what we're calling the adaptive immune response. Now this is a very specialized kind of system. So for it, what it's doing, it is not looking at out for all the bugs. It is particularly looking out what bug is actually causing infection. In this case, it would be particularly, I'm ignoring the bacteria, I'm ignoring this, but your body is fighting and saying, oh, I have a bug, we have COVID in your body. So how does this apply to COVID? We're having guys who are getting vaccinated by, you get your vaccine shot of COVID. And what is the vaccine doing? It is trying, you remember the immune system that I've just been talking about. So what this vaccine is doing, it is trying to, you know, to elicit that if your body, let's say, produces this amount of, you know, fight against the vaccine, against the COVID, what the vaccine is doing is like, we're helping the body take it a bit further. So that is class A. But another bit that I have labored to explain is your natural immunity. The ability of your body, you know, to fight, the ability of your body to fight even when it has had infection. And now that is one area that has really taken a back seat, which is natural immunity. And like the analogy that I was saying, we have a class. For you to be promoted to 60%, for you to be promoted to the next class, you need 60%. In this case, our 60% is, if you're vaccinated, there's a chance you can get there's a big chance that you're going to still get the disease. But we are saying it will not be severe. But the natural immunity side, your natural immunity that I've talked about, your adaptive immunity, has the ability that even when I've got the vaccine, I still have the fighting chance. And so this is one area that has taken a backseat because, say, for example, in Uganda, most of our recommendations, you know, we're getting our recommendations from
person's health. If they had it, that means they develop natural immunity, and then they decide to go ahead and get the vaccine. Is that going to impede their health in any way?
So, one thing that we also need to understand is that the science community, as is, does not have 100% of the answers to say, we've completely explored and say this is what COVID does and this is what the vaccine is. As you can see, these are trial things. We were bombarded by this situation of COVID, and science is working here and there to get a solution. But as of today, I cannot say that there is 100% solution to say that one, again, like I have explained, if you've got COVID, whether you've exposed, some of you, you just woke up and like, 2 weeks ago I wasn't testing. I wasn't, I didn't have the sense of test. That was exposure. So whether you've been vaccinated, okay, or you haven't been vaccinated, there is chance for reinfection, okay? But again, like I have said, it is not a question of whether you'll get whether you'll get COVID or not, but it's about severity. So, and the effects in terms of when someone has had COVID, how it affects their health, this is a very heterogeneous kind of, it's very variating in different people, that people have underlying diseases. So, it would be something that is different for each person. But in regards of whether you think you've been vaccinated and you will not get it, you'll still get it. So the more reason for us to say that there shouldn't be a mandate, to say, get vaccinated, because now that you're vaccinated, you're not going to have it. No, we are saying people still getting it. But I mean, that's the beauty of natural immunity, that you were exposed initially, so now your body has a fighting chance. It can remember. Your immune system has the ability to remember. So the next time COVID comes, believe me, some of you have got COVID again and you've not even had any effect on it, So again, still comes back to the mandate. Yeah, it is not something that we... Yes, Lucy.
That's very interesting. So yesterday I was listening to a discussion that was put forward by a scientist called Paul Alexander of the Brownston Institute, and he was talking about a certain minority group of people that are sort of inoculated. They cannot get COVID at all. Something about their body composition, they're not able, and it's not a huge percentage, probably like a 1% or 0.1% of the community that will be in places, probably even a hot zone of COVID, and will never get it. So,
that's beautiful.
It's a very interesting thing, because I realize that that's also with most of the endemics and endemic diseases and so many other diseases that have come out. There's always a certain percentage of people that will not get the disease. So what happens, and how does this impede them in case, with the vaccine mandate?
Okay. So that's very beautiful, because I would relate it in the work I have done before. There is a percentage of people who, whether what or what, will never get HIV, And in this case, you're saying there's a whole percentage of people who will never get COVID. And it's really about the science. So, like we've said, the virus has been able to, beat your first system, and now it has finally entered your body, and now your second immune system is mounting a response. So, of course, once a virus like that has, entered your body, and for the immune system to be able to fight it, it has to recognize it. And so to recognize it on cells, sometimes the cells have, things that we call receptors. So once a virus is, moving around, it finds it, it gets it and says, oh, hi guys, I've been able to find a virus, so the body fights against it. So those populations of people, there are different characteristics for the virus to be able to succeed. And by that I mean from the point of entry, for it to be able to enter your body and actually start to cause disease. So that whole series of events has, it has so much science in it, but one example that I would give is that cell receptor. So Some people will get that because the virus has the ability to attach to a cell and then cause infection. So you find that there is a category of people that with such cell receptors naturally on their cells, there are no cell receptors for that. So the virus does not have the ability to attach to their cells to cause infection. And we've seen, this is not a new thing, we've seen it in people with HIV. There's a whole segment of people, because they do not have that receptor on their cell where HIV can attach, they will never get HIV because it can't attach. So, I mean, there would be different mechanisms, but it's very possible that we do have a population. So now that comes to that question, you know, this mandate. So what happens to people like those in the population, you know, that do not, I mean, you're forcefully saying, I cannot access this place because I've not been vaccinated. But we're talking about natural immunity. We're talking about a population of people that cannot even be, you know, infected by this virus. So as you can see, there are loopholes that need to be addressed in this regard.
That is so true. Thank you so much, Dr. Carol. And Jeffrey Tucker is in. Thank you so much for joining us. Jeffrey is the founder of Brown Street Institute, and he's an author, a former editorial director of the American Institute of Economics Research. He's also a very vocal critic of lockdowns, masks, and vaccine mandates. And he's a Christian and a former choir master under the Catholic Church. His latest book actually that came out, and when I looked online, had many raving reviews, Liberty or Lockdowns. It's been well received for style research, the insight that he promotes, and the fact that he has thrown a lot of light in regards to the COVID-19 pandemic and the mandates, lockdown, everything. He has such a wealth of knowledge in that particular book. Thank you so much for joining us, Jeffrey. Hello? All right, he will be joining us soon. We have Mr. Kiza Aaron, who is the prominent human rights activist and lawyer, managing partner of Mugisha and Kiza Advocates. Thank you so much for joining us. I know that you might not have so much time to be with us, but we've had a lot from the doctor talking about natural immunity, about the little things that the media and even government has missed. Basically, politicians, the media, and possibly the science world has not really talked about, and we're only focusing on one thing. We've gone linear with get vaccinated or you are ostracized against. And that's something that is definitely, touching on the human rights of so many people, because if they're saying, in so many different countries, Australia, for example, is a country that we're all looking at and we're saying, what is going on? Because it's become an issue of, if you're not vaccinated, then you cannot work here, you cannot do this, you cannot access certain amenities. It's happening in the US, it's happening in Europe. Over the weekend, there were actually protests that came up because of the vaccine passports and the mandates. And I know that some countries in Europe are going back into lockdown because they have had a surge in cases of COVID. But the thing is that this is seeping into our daily lives. It's disrupting and interrupting the fabric of people's lives. People are losing their jobs left, right, and center. People are not allowed to walk into certain places. Other people are not being given treatment because they do not have the vaccine. So basically, we are all getting very antsy about this. As a human rights activist, what do you have to say?
Thank you very much. It is my honor and privilege to address this enlightened gathering. I had the benefit of listening to the immunologist, you should take that label. I think the key point to emphasize from the human rights angle is that while vaccines are generally good, there is no legal basis for forcing people to blanket forcing of people to have vaccines. The mandate of government is to encourage people to take up these vaccines, but to really push them down their throats is an abuse of power, abuse of discretion, and it militates against personal liberty, it militates against the autonomy. And again, as the doctor or immunologist will agree with us, there is something called consent. Even in pure medical ethics, people are not supposed to be forced to have medication. One of the general comments on the right to heresy and the right to torture, they consider that as a form of actually torture. If you're going to force people to take a certain medical experiment, a certain medical mandate, then you are like subjecting them to at least mental torture and mental inconvenience. So it is incumbent upon government to find ways of campaigning for these vaccines if they are really very good. For me, I couldn't, I don't mind people taking vaccines, but I also don't mind people not taking them, because that should be a matter of choice. People have a right to dignified life, and that dignity is injured when you force people to take some medication. We have seen this debate region in Europe, in what even, forcing people to take medication is a very, very serious issue. It has huge human rights implications on body autonomy, consent, ethics, administrative power, and really it brings into question the whole function of the state. Is it really the function of the state to ensure that people are vaccinated against their will? That is, for me, not that would be my short answer.
Right. Thank you so much. We have Jeffrey Tucker in, and this question ties right in with the book that he wrote recently, actually in 2020, Liberty or Lockdown. Thank you so much for joining us, Jeffrey.
Thanks for having me. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you okay. It's an honor to have you here. And we were just talking about how your book, Liberty or Lockdown, has been greatly received by so many people. And they have said, wow, what an eye-opening book, what an eye-opening narration that you have there. You throw in a whole lot of wealth in regards to COVID-19, to lockdowns, and a whole history of it, which is amazing, because we need books like that in this time in order to debunk the science, or the so-called science, and basically talk about human rights and what is COVID-19 and how is it affecting our lives, and why is it being given such a center stage in our lives at this very time. So I would love you to just give us an overview of the book in regards to our liberties.
The idea of locking down had never been tried before in the history of the world for around the globe for a respiratory disease. It makes no sense whatsoever. But the theory behind lockdown began about 15 years ago under the George W. Bush administration in 2006. And these people were pushing this idea, and it took them 15 years to finally get a chance to do it. And when SARS-CoV-2 came along, they decided to try it. That was already in March of 2020, but it was a disaster. I feel like I need to apologize to everybody in the world on behalf of America, because I think the United States is the country that kind of kicked off a lot of the lockdowns around the world, because people thought if it was going on in the United States, where we have rights and liberties, then they should do it too. And I can just tell you, it was a catastrophe in the United States, suddenly being told that you can't travel, you can't go to church, you have to close your business, you are not allowed to have a party in your house. And for a lot of months in the spring and summer of 2020, they were drones were being flown over venues to see if there were lots of cars there, and if there were, then the police would come in and arrest everybody. And this was happening in the United States. It was the worst attack on liberty by far in my lifetime, maybe in 100 years in the United States. And the incredible thing about all this stuff is, of course, it did nothing to stop the virus. It did nothing, and that's true all over the world. There's not any evidence that these lockdowns have actually, in any sense, mitigated disease or made anybody well or protected anybody from the virus and so on. This is for most people, it's a mild infection. For the elderly with health problems, it can be very serious. But there's a huge range of difference between how it affects healthy young people and how it affects the elderly. The average globally, the average age of severe outcomes, and including death from this virus, is roughly equal to the average lifespan. So this is an end of life problem more than anything else, and that's always been true. But these policies that they were implemented were almost like an experiment to see how much government can control us. But it took away human rights and led to tremendous evil. Lots of children being denied access to medical care and vaccinations that children would normally get, but they did not get. Cancer screenings were way down. In the United States, you couldn't even go to the dentist to get your teeth fixed.
Right.
So it was a heartbreaking time, and suicides went way up. Drug overdoses, we lost 100,000 people in the United States due to drug overdoses in the last 12 months, and alcoholism and ill health. And I'm not sure if I mentioned this, but all the schools in the United States were closed, so the children didn't even have schools to go to. And suddenly all these families were living at home, and there was a huge increase in child abuse. So it's a terrible, terrible tragedy. So my book was designed to kind of highlight, the errors of this whole thing. And the sad thing for me is that you don't see too many people admitting it, that what they did was really wrong. Instead, they said, okay, here's our vaccine, and now you have to get it. But people do not trust this vaccine. It's not been through the normal trials. It's a technology that's not been proven as safe and effective. And now the data is coming in on the vaccine that's showing that it's associated with a lot of adverse effects. And I can just tell you right now, I all day, every day, I'm the president of the Brownstow Institute. I get letters from parents whose children have developed, very serious heart conditions, some dying. They're certain that it's due to the vaccine. But there's no way to prove that, of course, and the CDC just completely dismisses it. But there's a lot of adverse effects from this, and I think the point that you made is right. It's if you want the vaccine, you should get it, but it shouldn't be required. And the other thing to remember is that this vaccine is not designed as a sterilizing vaccine. It doesn't actually keep the infection away, and it doesn't stop the spread. So it's not actually contributing to community immunity or population immunity the way a normal vaccine would. So we've got a real problem. And now, you saw over the weekend what's happening. I don't know if it's being reported.
It's been reported in certain, of course, not the mainstream media, concerning are you talking about the riots and the protests that are going on in Europe?
All over the world, in Ireland, but it's also happening in the Caribbean and
Yes.
all over the United States, and in Austria, New Zealand, Australia. And these people are taking great risks because they've been threatened with arrest. Sometimes police are firing on people.
Yes.
So like over the weekend, millions of people all over the world were protesting against this. So it's like the world is feels like the world is on fire right now. And I predicted all of this. Back in March 2020, I wrote that you can't treat people this way and not expect, very bad outcomes to happen.
Backlash. Yeah, I think one of the biggest wins that we had was when OSHA basically said, okay, we're not going to go forward with the mandates, and they suspended it for some time. I think that was a big win. However, I feel that that despite because the president already called that out and said, well, we're going to mandate this for businesses, OSHA, as much as OSHA has taken a stand and said, we're not going to go forward with this for some time, I think employees and employers are probably not yet doing it. They're not yet going to that. They're still going ahead with mandating vaccines. And the question is, what do we do? What can we do to get to the to talk to or to get employers to back down?
So just to be clear, two courts have said this rule is unconstitutional, and
Yes.
OSHA specifically said they will not be implementing or enforcing this vaccine. But then the White House spokesperson, Jan Psaki, said businesses should do it anyway. So this is literally lawless behavior. I mean, this
Right.
is lawless. So if any employer is mandating that the employee get the vaccine, that employer is breaking the law. It's technically in violation of the law, and you can just say absolutely not. And if they try to fire you, you can just sue them, and you will win, and you will win a lot of money.
That's
So you should absolutely fight this. I mean, to be clear, we now have 129 studies about robust immunity that comes from natural infection. It's like what we were always taught for respiratory virus like this. If you get it and you get over it, then you have most likely lifetime of immunities. And there is a study that just came out yesterday that examined like 100,000 people and didn't find a single case of reinfection after natural infection. So if you've had COVID, and most everybody is going to get it at some point in your lifetime. And it's something that we knew already in February of 2020. This is a common textbook virus, and everybody's going to get it. But if you've had it, your immune system adapts to it. And so there's no real case for getting a vaccine if you've had natural immunity. It doesn't make any sense. And in the United States, probably half the population has already had it, maybe more. We don't know because the CDC doesn't do proper seroprevalence studies of these kinds of things. But around the world, most everybody has had it, and most everybody is already immune.
Mm-hmm. So going back to your book, when you're discussing lockdowns, there's a very specific chapter, really interesting, where you talk about, because you're a Catholic and you have been in the church, actively involved in the church as a choir master. So my question is it even wise or right to say, well, churches shouldn't open? Because we've had so many places that have been mandated to close because they've been considered super spreaders. We have Thanksgiving coming around, Christmas coming around. Dr. Fauci is saying, we're not really sure that we should open up these places. We're not sure people should gather. What is your perspective as a Christian also about, the closure of churches and the fact that in your book, you talked about a time that Jesus was quarantined?
Oh, yeah. So, no, I mean, the churches should have stayed open. I mean, especially in times of pandemics, the churches need to be there for people to comfort loved ones and to have funerals and continue the ministry. That's what Jesus was all about. And I can't believe the churches went along with these closures. The Catholic Church in particular was very disappointing that they just kind of went along with these things. It was... We have a thing called the First Amendment, which guarantees the rights of religious liberty. But for something like a year, we didn't have any religious liberty at all. Jesus himself would never avoid the sick. He always went to the sick and invited people that were called lepers even to dinner, and he mixed with this as a lesson to us that we should not separate ourselves based on these kinds of status, vaccinated, unvaccinated. That's the basis of discrimination and segregation, and that's morally wrong. Jesus himself healed the lepers by declaring them clean and letting them enter the temple again. And then one time he even got in trouble for doing it. They sent him into quarantine, So anyway, he gave us a good example of how to deal with infectious disease, which is to heal the sick.
Yeah, which makes it very interesting, considering that churches are supposed to follow the teachings of Jesus and are supposed to follow him. why would they? I know that there are certain particular churches that actually mandated vaccines before you could get into places of worship, which was disappointing. Now, they have really put out that, places like churches are super spreaders. But what do you think about that? I mean, super spreader a church, and yet Olympic Games happened and they were not super spreaders?
Yeah, there was lots of protests in the summer over police brutality, and those were not super spreader events.
Right.
But they would call church a super spreader event. But there was never any evidence that the churches were spreading the germs. This is just kind of bad science. This is just things that people said, but they could never cite any actual data on this. It was not the case, and it was really sad. In England, they shut all the churches and they wouldn't let the choirs meet and sing. So you have these traditions of 500 years of choirs going on that was stopped by the government for almost a year. Wouldn't let people sing. I mean, it's just. I have a friend of mine who's a choir master at the Brompton Oratory in London. He's writing an article on this, but he directs a boys' choir. For many of the boys, if you stop them from singing, then you ruin the choir because their voices are changing very quickly,
Right.
and they have to be able to sing and practice through that change and go from being a treble down to a tenor or a bass. And they ruined his entire choir for the better part of a year. So it's just the idea that we would have let somebody like Fauci do this to the world. And I think every country has its own Fauci kind of person, probably.
Yeah.
Somebody who thinks he knows everything and tells everybody what to do. But these people are using bad science, and they should not be trusted. And I'm so happy and gratified to see that it feels like the world has finally woken up.
Right, that they're beginning to see the light. And the fact that possibly COVID has become more a political statement than it is actually a disease. And I take this from, I went to your website and I read an article where you said how fanatics took over the world. And it was very insightful because you talk about the genesis of these lockdowns when you talk to, I guess I would consider him the father of lockdowns, Dr. Rajiv, and then how he teamed up with Robert Glass, the computer scientist.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting. And I would love for you to throw more light for us on how COVID, a disease, has been politicized and how it is still being politicized, and people are, just drinking that Kool-Aid.
Yeah, it's become a kind of in the United States a symbol of who you support. So if you support Biden, then you wear a mask and you wear gloves, and you're all afraid of the disease. Maybe you need a gas mask or something. I don't know. And then if you don't, then you just go about your life normally. So this is the problem when you put disease mitigation in the hands of politicians, and that's what they did. You mentioned that conversation I had with this guy who used to be head of the Gates Foundation. He called me because he was really upset because I was writing against the lockdowns in March and really since January 2020. And I was one of the few people that was writing about this, with strong opposition, because everybody else was kind of scared, And he called me up and tried to talk me into stop writing about it and to back the lockdowns. We just mostly argued. It went on for about 30 minutes. And I think it wasn't just me he called. I think he must have called anybody who was opposing the lockdowns to try to scare them. And he was trying to scare me, Like, I'm a powerful guy. You really need to stop writing this. But he could never explain to me. I kept asking him, what happens to the virus? If you lock down and everybody stays hiding in their homes, where does the virus go? And he could never really answer that. And even in April of 2020, he was telling me that we have to wait for the vaccine, which shocked me because I don't think there was any. Even at that time, I didn't think there's any likelihood of a vaccine. So one of the problems is that these coronaviruses are very difficult to develop vaccines for because they change, they mutate all the time. There's some things like polio rubella and some other things that are very stable and you can vaccinate against them. And there's those sterilizing vaccines and they're good. But the coronaviruses just are changing too rapidly. And if you vaccinate against one strain, then it just produces another strain and another strain. And that's exactly what's happened. So the vaccines did come along, but they did not achieve what he wanted. And so now they tell us still, oh, now we still have to lock down. We still have to lock down. I don't think we're going to have any more lockdowns in the United States. I say that, but I don't know that for sure. Because cases are definitely going up because it's wintertime.
Yes.
And we're going to get another round of cases in the Northeast, especially. And then as the summer arrives, it's going to be in the South. We could see some more lockdowns in the United States, New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, but it's all political. It's very strange. It's like the people who support Biden are all in favor of violating everybody's rights to associate, and destroying their businesses. I don't know why they think this is good. It's very, very bad for the economy.
Yeah, because in the article you say that what we're seeing today is ideological fanaticism in play. And it looks like that's exactly what's happening with the lockdowns. No one has actually mentioned the fact that during the colder seasons, we have the flu going around. So even the flu is being classified as COVID, most possibly. And that's very unfortunate. Now, we have other countries, apart from the USA, we have other countries in the world that seem to possibly not have the numbers that the US has had or Europe has had. I mean, the US has had the most astounding numbers world over. But why should countries like Uganda or, a continent like Africa be interested in this discussion?
Well, because I think what's happening is that disease is being used as an excuse to violate people's rights. And you're right that some places are more severe than others. The Oceania region most likely has cross immunities from SARS-CoV-1, so they were not hit as bad. Africa has not suffered nearly as much as Europe and the United States. This is mostly due to a kind of an immunological map. But the problem is that once you give government the power to control disease, which it cannot do, then you give it just this, you unleash these violations of human rights. The governments are just taking away people's freedoms. And it's a big excuse to do what governments like to do, which is to control you. But we need to get smart about it and not allow these kinds of things to happen anywhere in the world. Another place that suffered enormously is Central and South America.
Right.
Some governments like Argentina and Guatemala locked down very, very hard. But other places like Nicaragua, they didn't lock down at all. The president there said, we're not going to lock down. We're too poor to lock down. That's crazy. If we tell everybody they can't work, then they'll all just starve. And Nicaragua didn't have any worse problems than anybody else. So it doesn't matter whether you lock down or not. You're still going to have COVID,
Right.
So you have a choice. You can have COVID and take care of the sick. Mm-hmm. And then otherwise let people live their lives. Mm-hmm. Or you can destroy human rights and still people are going to get sick. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. We'll be circling right back to you. And now I'd like to take it to a journalist, Agatha Atahiri. Agatha, thank you so much for joining us. We are really heated on this discussion of COVID, and everyone's talking about how there's so many unconstitutional events or constitutional laws that have been put in place in regards to COVID. And one of them, and I think that the media is sort of the mouthpiece of all peoples in regards to what's going on. The media has been reporting many things, a lot of things. And you as a person in the media, what is your view of the information that's been given out by the media?
Hi, Lucy. I am glad to be here. Hi, everyone. I'm glad to be part of this discussion. And I highlighted something that Jeffrey Tucker talked about. I wanted to begin with that, that that the disease has been used as an excuse to violate human rights. And I keep thinking, when I see people in the USA crying, I wonder what we should do who live in dictatorships that had been waiting for an excuse like this that will give them the leeway to really trample over people's liberties. And that's what has been happening in Uganda for the last coming to 2 years now. The question you asked me about the media. Now, the media doesn't control this narrative because in Uganda, the media gets information about COVID from only the government. So we have been just regurgitating what the Ministry of Health says. At some point, it became criminal to go and say something different. So right from the onset, we did not have the liberty to say what we think, to say that the government is doing something wrong by putting lockdowns in place, even when there were so many effects, there were so many dangers that the lockdown was causing and has still caused. Because, for example, you cannot put a lockdown against COVID and forget that you have a hand-to-mouth economy. You're shielding people from COVID, so you don't care if they die of starvation. You are shielding people from COVID, and pregnant mothers are dying because they cannot access hospitals. TB patients, young children. So many things, especially during the first lockdown in 2020, all that was happening. But us as journalists, we could not go and freely say, we think this is wrong. So we had only one source of information about COVID, and that was the Ministry of Health up to now. It's where we go and get and attend press conferences. They control the narrative. So I think that as far as COVID is concerned, especially in this country, the media's hands were tied, have been tied. Because in the end, like I said, it had become criminal, and everyone who went on TV and said that I don't think a lockdown is necessary, because the fatality rate of COVID was what? Look at that against how many people die of malaria, against how many women die in labor. So I started to agree with what had been written at the start, that the issue with COVID was not about how many people it kills, but who it kills. Because while the big and mighty can shield themselves from malnutrition, from starvation, from malaria, from cholera, they could not do that with COVID, so they had to do whatever it takes to control it, even if that meant the majority in Uganda being the people that go to town and ride a motorcycle taxi and get what to eat that day. Even if that means, so the women that were sleeping in markets, the sanitation in the markets is deplorable. The living conditions, but when they lock down, they tell the women to stay in the markets. So all that is something that makes you realize that we should have had these discussions more candidly and openly, and agreed that we are actually losing more as a result of these measures we are putting in place to combat COVID, rather than from COVID itself.
Okay. So recently you challenged the Low Development Center's inefficient management measures because of the measures that they took during lockdowns, and you actually, had a big win for that. Can you give us perspective in light of the future of education institutions post-COVID-19?
Now the biggest problem now has been the education sector, and because I think it's not a physical effects that we see, we have tended to trivialize it. But when you look at, I think Uganda's institutions have been closed for over 80 weeks now. If you have institutions closed for over 80 weeks, I don't know, I should get, before we finish, I'll send a message with the statistics of how many young girls of 12, 13, 14 have gotten pregnant during this time, because I know in one district there are over 1,000. Now imagine if we looked at all the 145 districts in Uganda. So the issues that when COVID now comes in and adds to the issues we have always had in education institutions in this country, which issues really stem from bad governance? Because like they say, fish rots from the head. I am glad you know that the Minister of Education right now is the First Lady. Mm-hmm. So I always think that all these issues we grapple with in education institutions come from the top, that the country is poorly managed and governed. So the people, wherever in these micro institutions, wherever they are, they also decide that we can do whatever we want and get away with it, because that's what had been happening at the Lord Center, where I challenged the abuse of rights of students there. And the problems were not really because of COVID. The problems had been there before, but I think COVID now made the numbers in terms of the victims more unmanageable and really too many to ignore. So the education sector, I don't know how it will be revived, if that is possible. But it's something that those rights are enshrined in our constitution. Article 30 talks about the right to education. Whereas I know that the panic was to control a disease, but you cannot take 2 years without a plan of, okay, I can control a disease, but also ensure that children are not seated at home for almost 100 weeks. So the education sector might be hard to really revive it. And I feel sorry for our children, because while in other countries they were able to put in place digital means, in this country, not even I don't think you can even find 5% of the school-going children able to access a computer and use it. So in this country, it's a country where international schools open, but schools for the majority of the children have remained closed for all this time. And that's really problematic and very dangerous for the education system.
Yes, and we know that Jeffrey actually mentioned, he spoke about what was happening with the lockdowns and how it is just not practical for many places. And we've talked about, and human rights activists are definitely out there talking about people's rights being infringed upon. One of them is children being stopped from going to school, which really doesn't make sense considering the fact that most that the rate of infection and deaths amongst children is the lowest ever. But how is it going to be mitigated? And I'm taking this question on to Jeffrey, and I want to ask about how we can deal with the fact that schools are locked down and children in some places are not going to school. How is that going to impede on basically their mental health, on the country as a whole, on the whole idea of children being even considered super spreaders? How is that practical?
One of the things that happened in Sweden is that they never shut down the schools at all. And there wasn't a single death in all of Sweden. They kept the schools running the entire time. And that's what all countries in the world should have done that. The kids are not vulnerable to severe outcomes from SARS-CoV-2. We've known that for 2 years already. Instead, we took away 2 years of education from people. And this is the effects of this are going to last for the next 80 years. It's a disaster for an entire generation. They have mental health difficulties. And the masks that we're telling them to wear, you take away their children's ability to see other people's faces, and they can't learn to speak properly. They can't learn to pronounce words properly. And they lose a sense of humanity and a sense of the dignity of others. We're teaching a whole generation of children that their breath is poisonous, and that everybody else represents a threat to them. This is a incredible and very evil and dangerous thing for children to believe about themselves. So they think that they're poisonous people and everybody else is a threat to them. That's not a good basis for development and for living a good life. So it's so terrible what's happened to the children over the last 2 years, that having 2 years of education taken away, a lot of them are just having to start over, learning to read and learning to do math and learning the basic skills. So disruptive. And the people who did this should be absolutely forced to pay a price. I feel awful for all the parents. In the United States, many, many women had to just leave their work entirely. Millions of women just left their work entirely to take care of their children at home, because they had no choice. So right now we have a lower level of women with children, fewer participating in the labor force than we've had since 1980. That's how many women have dropped out of the labor force. So this has been terrible for women's work lives. And then they were forced to just educate their children at home. And now you see the public schools, many people are not wanting to go back to the public schools. Instead, they're having to pay for private school or just homeschool. So it's been tragically disruptive. And I don't know. I think it's going to be a very long time before we discover the terrible thing that's happened to them. Another thing that's very interesting about this is that because the kids were not allowed to be around other children, they did not get exposure to pathogens. So their immune systems were degraded and not as strong as they otherwise would be. And what happened actually this fall is that a lot of students went back to school in the United States, and you know what? They all started getting diseases all over the place, of course, because their immune systems were weakened. And you talk to a typical college freshman today, and they'll tell you, "Oh, I've been sick every week since I got to school." It's always something every week, and the reason for that is that their immune systems got no practice for 2 years.
Right. That's
very dangerous, like educationally, and in terms of public health. It's very dangerous for children not to be around other children and playing and being in crowds and that sort of thing. It's very dangerous for them.
That's true. If Kiza Aaron is here, I would like to ask him, because Uganda is facing one of those. It's very tragic that children are still home and haven't gone back to school. And as a human rights activist, because children literally need an adult to represent them in cases against them. And this, in my opinion, seems like a very big human rights issue. What would you do, or what's your role as a human rights activist in trying to sensitize the public, even the government, in regards to children being set back, not going to school in this time? I think Kiza is not in at the moment. All right, I'm going to take this to Simon. He's a lawyer. Simon Senyonga, the question I've asked is about children and about their rights, and how, as a lawyer, I'm sure that you kind of teeter along the lines of human rights. What would be your opinion, especially in Uganda? We do not have children going to school. They haven't gone to school in 2 years, literally. What do you have to say about this?
My first comment is just to look at the review of the president. He has made about 6 speeches ever since the nation was locked down on 18th March 2020. The last time he addressed the teachers on 10th October 2021, during the National Teachers' Day in Uganda, he said that it's okay for children to get pregnant as long as they're not dying. The First Lady went ahead, I think, to also affirm the same statements, that it's okay for children to start. And she was meeting foreign ambassadors from different nations, And she said that, it's okay for the children to remain at home. This is not something very dangerous. We have to first save lives. So the question of saving lives has been interpreted as the extensive non-reopening of the schools. That's the first perspective you look at. Now we have line ministries which are in charge of the well-being of children. For example, the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Gender, Labor and Social Development. Let me give you the Ministry of Education. It designed a curriculum and actually it passed a budget, a very hefty budget of millions of dollars to ensure that they give a particular level of education to the children during the lockdown. Specifically, they said they contracted a private company to manufacture radios. They also said they will distribute education materials through the leading print and media company in Uganda, which is the New Vision. They also said that they will be having students will be instructed through online platforms. But from the aspect of defending the rights of the children, of the freedom of education or the right to education of the children, you're looking at, number one, a perspective which is not sustainable, number two, which is discriminative. Because you see, when you discuss the question of education, as a lawyer I will tell you, education is discussed around four principles. Number one, the principle of availability, the principle of accessibility, the principle of affordability, and the principle of adequacy. Is the education adequate? Is it affordable? Is it accessible? Is it available? Now, what COVID-19 has done for the government of Uganda is that, number one, they have failed to uphold the principle of availability. All right? So internet penetration in Uganda is maximally low, at least according to the Ministry of Information and Technology. Internet penetration is low. That means the basic Ugandan is not able to access the education material that the government of Uganda is purporting, to advance. Number two, the education is not efficient, because right now you're transferring. I like what Taka was saying, that it is very dangerous to keep children away from each other. But above all, it's actually much more dangerous when children are not able to access, especially in low development countries like Uganda, for them not to access the in-person learning. Right now, you're having students who have reported to universities in Uganda, that's the higher level of education, and universities are locking them out. Why? Because they're not following the mandatory vaccination. In Chambogo University, I've seen it in YMC, I've seen it in KIU, where they're stopping students from accessing education. So availability has been hindered, efficiency has been hindered, accessibility has been hindered, and even the adequacy of the education. So look at the frequency of how much this educational material can interact with the learners. So you have you have multiple media platforms in Uganda where supposedly education is supposed to be taking place. Most of these are owned by private persons who are aligned to the government. Agatha made a very important point. In Uganda right now, when you speak on issues of the on the right to education, because the holder of the office is the wife of the sitting president, a scrutiny on the freedom of education is perceived as a scrutiny on the person of the First Lady of Uganda. So, in essence, you are not able to interrogate the challenges that have happened. The Initiative for Social and Economic Rights in Uganda has issued about 3 reports which have been analyzing the dire state of the education system ever since the lockdown happened. And I'll tell you this, for example, in one of those reports, it was called COVID-19, Where Did the Money Go? One of the interesting reports was issued, and you know what, analysis was made, and a supplementary budget was passed in 2020, a supplementary budget was passed to aid the education of the learners. Now, number one, when the budget was passed, it was not acted upon. But secondly, even the monies which came through that particular supplementary budget were misused. So the contractors who were given to supply these materials for the learners misused the money. So what does that speak to? The failure of the government to uphold the fullness of the freedom of the right to education during the COVID pandemic. So from my angle, when you ask me, from my angle as a lawyer, I'll break down the freedom of education from those 4 principles, and you measure the government and its performance based on actually how they have performed on all of those 4 principles.
right. When we talk about freedoms being infringed, just as I asked Mr. Tucker in regards to churches being closed down, because that's also another infringement of human rights. You also, Mr. Tucker talked about how in these times we actually need people to converge. So my question to you is, it seems that there's been a sort of disparity here. Churches are closed down, but those say bars are okay to be opened up. So does that mean that bars are much more suitable for people to converge at and less spreaders than churches? What would be your take on that?
I think it goes back to the whole bastardization of the politics of Uganda, where I think the president has made deliberate commentary to attack the institution of the churches. Now, just for purposes of context for Tucker, who may not be in Uganda, over the 6 presidential addresses ever since March 2020 to right now where we are, the president has specifically chosen language that I perceive as an attack to the places of worship. In his addresses, he will call places of worship, or he will always use the language of, churches are filled with false, or not church, but actually the fight of COVID-19 has been derailed because of false prophets. Now, when you use such language, it has religious connotation to it. So it's not just a political language. You would have said they are false scientists. You would have said they are false economists, but you chose the language of false prophets. So that is actually an outright attack on the places of worship. Secondly, he takes the whole aspect of the fight against COVID-19 so lightly that they will categorize in general terms places of worship as super spreaders without any scientific evidence to demonstrate that places of worship are super spreaders. I'll just remind you that when the president addressed the nation in May 2021, he said there was scientific evidence to demonstrate that actually schools are super spreaders. They also went ahead to make, sort of like rapid analysis around markets and, all these shopping malls, which show that actually they were super spreaders. It's only for the places of worship, which were not ever given clear statistics. So it was a whole generalization, all right, of the aspect of, for the places of worship to be super spreaders. But secondly, look at the preconditions. In Uganda right now, places of worship are partially opened, primarily on about 4 SOPs. Number one, they're supposed to have, the preacher and the worshiper are supposed to put on masks fully. Number two, they're supposed to make sure that they popularize the government agenda on vaccination, extremely problematic. Number three, they're telling you that you must be able to have caps, caps on the numbers. Only 200 people are supposed to gather. But you see the same things are not happening for the bars. You will be reminded, Lucy and Taka, who may not be in Uganda, that Uganda right now is suffering terror attacks. As of last week, I think we had two bomb attacks. The other week we had a scare over, I think a bomb went off somewhere around Komamboga. And guess what? The bomb went off during curfew time. And guess what? Recently we had a lawyer, all right, a person who is an officer of court who died in a bar brawl past curfew hours, late into the wee hours of the night. So all that goes to demonstrate that actually, whereas the bars are open and they are taken, nobody is able to curtail them. In Uganda, should places which hold people over 200 worshippers be opened, then it becomes an outright attack. But I'll finalize with this. The specific SOP that tells the places of worship to popularize the government mandate on vaccines is actually a re-emergence of a particular bill which was fought by human rights activists in Uganda. In 2018, a group of, then led by the Minister of Ethics and Integrity, together with a particular department under the Office of the President, came up with the law called the Religious and Faith-Based Organizations Policy. The intention of this policy in terms of its implementation was to coerce the places of worship to popularize government mandate, to popularize government programs. Now, COVID-19 gave the government a quick platform to actually extend that agenda. Now, right now, what government is doing is that, okay, if you fought us in 2018 around against the Religious and Faith-Based Organization Policy, in 2021, you will have to actually deliberately. So they spin it. It stops being an issue of integrity, which they wanted to solve recently, but now it becomes an issue of health. And because government has postured itself as the dominant power and the source of knowledge about health issues, then they will want to control the places of worship. So when you read Jeffrey Tucker's book on lockdowns and liberty, the chapter that you are quoting, when Jesus was quarantined, the idea of quarantining Jesus, and I think he was citing from the book of Mark 1, 43 to 45, thereabouts, and he was talking about, Jesus having to, heal the lepers and all these people. But guess what the government was doing in essence? The government was imputing, it was sort of imputing a consciousness of you being a super spreader from the biblical times. So what we are seeing right now is a simply follow through of the story from the biblical times. What happened to Jesus right in that time is happening even right now. And yet, when you look at how previous pandemics and epidemics have been handled, churches have not been closed down. I think, again, when you look at some of the material that has been, the material from Jeffrey Tucker, when you look at the smallpox pandemic, there was no lockdown of the places of worship. Yes, some places locked down, but it wasn't like, the language that you use, Jeffrey, is that it was not instant, they were sporadic. It was from time to time, it wasn't instant. When you read the Asian flu pandemic, there was no closure of places of worship. So what makes COVID so unique that places of worship have to be attacked?
Thank you so much, Simon. And I think I'm going to take this to Dr. Carol very quickly in regards to lockdowns in different places. And also, I think the question that has come up is does it even work to say these particular places are super spreaders? What determines, in your opinion as a doctor, are there places actually that can be considered super spreaders? Are there people who are? What determines that in medical terms?
Okay. In regard to COVID, I'll get this definition from, I think it's CDC, where what they're saying is usually a COVID patient has the ability to spread the disease to, I think, 2 to 3 people. But what they're defining super spreaders are, they're defining them as the people who have the ability to spread more than their recommended number, which is 3. So the ability for them to spread 5 or more to numerous number of people. So this, again, this is something that is very funny that we are talking about post-lockdown. So for them to say that let's say, for example, places of worship, to say that, small cohorts of people meeting are super spreaders, it's really, again, I would say, fake science. If we are talking about it in terms of initially how COVID came up, yeah, you'd say exposure, the immunity, your immune system has not been exposed to COVID. So definitely when more people were meeting, one person has it, it was able to spread. But to bring the super spreader theory right now, after people's immunity has been exposed, is not really something that we should front and say, oh no, now, gather.
It's a myth. Basically, it's a myth. Okay, so I'm going to take us to Agatha. And Agatha, as a media person, as a person who's worked in the media and still works in the media, we just talked to Jeffrey Tucker, and he mentioned how basically over the weekend there's been protests that have been going on. They actually have been going on for a while now, since COVID started, and since we've had a lot of these, the mandates coming in, and everyone feels like they're really pushed to the, it's between a rock and a hard place for so many people. And my question is, why is it that the media has been silent on covering protests, massive protests against the vaccine, against COVID lockdowns? Is it just cowardice, competence, is it disinterest, or is it a lack of a capacity? Are people just not able to?
Thank you, Lucy. I think I had touched on that question earlier when I talked about us having one source of information about COVID. And also, when you talk about the lack of capacity, yes, it is true. Because we are dealing with a pandemic that even the scientists themselves had to experiment so many times over so many things and the vaccine itself. So it looked like us in the media, we had no basis, no knowledge to question and counter the government narrative. So when the government came and said, you must wear masks or sit at home or tell people to sit at home, we took that as the only way. Because this is something we had never even envisaged dealing with. And also it comes to us, just journalists, we have no science background. Even the scientists themselves, we didn't trust because everything looked like trial and error. Now that's one. And I think it's the major issue that on something else I could come and say, no, but this and this, I have knowledge about it, I understand how it works, so it doesn't work. But with media, with COVID, we always tried to say, that's the only way to save lives, because it was something we were not familiar with. But secondly, it also comes back to the sort of dictatorship some of us live in or operate in. For example, in Uganda, when the pandemic was declared in March last year, there were some statutory instruments that the Ministry of Health came up with. So the Uganda's institution, whereas it gives liberties to people, it also puts wide and discretionary limitations to those liberties under Article 43. So they moved under that article to bring in instruments to stop the spread of the virus. Now, these instruments were criminalizing some things, like you couldn't. Now, for journalists to go on TV or write in the papers and say, no, we are not accepting this, you were afraid to do that because that had become criminal. All those, we are gagged in that way, but also because we didn't know the alternatives. That if I say lockdown is not the right course of action, I didn't have the alternative of this is what has worked where. But of course, from the start, we all, I think, thought or realized that the measures to curb COVID-19 in a country like ours, and I think in many other countries, were always going to be more disastrous than the COVID-19 itself, as I explained earlier. So that's what handicapped us mostly. And we had campaigns run by journalists themselves of stay at home. I think especially during this phase, the prominent journalists ran these campaigns on TVs of stay at home and wear your masks, because that's the only narrative we knew.
Okay, thank you so much. So we have some comments coming in from the chat. Ken was saying, when we're talking about natural immunity, and he says that surely there's been, I think the science community has really laid back, has been taking a back seat on natural immunity. And we also have Sauda, who has sent a link, a video, and well, I'll look at that later. But he says that she says, Sauda, CDC China admitting that they would not isolate the COVID-19 vaccine. And also, the second question is, what is in the COVID-19 vaccine? The pandemic went down without proper vaccine, and is it worth the fact? Is it worth, is it worth the fuss? That's what they're asking. What's in the COVID-19 vaccine? And without a proper vaccine, isolation, is it worth the fuss? I believe that this is something that would go to Dr. Carroll, and the question of, do we know what components are in the vaccine anyway? And I did read an article again on the Brownstein Institute where we had a doctor talking about the efficacy of the vaccines reducing rapidly, and how, if they're reducing rapidly, why do we need mandates? And then we have boosters coming up. That's a whole other question altogether. But I'm going to quickly take this to Dr. Carroll, if you can answer the question of what's in the COVID-19 vaccines, and also a question in regards to boosters. Is it too soon to get boosters?
Okay, thank you for that question. Really, vaccines there are so many different kinds of vaccine, but just to really put it in simple terms, is vaccines, what they are is they are naturally introducing components that have the measles, it has the ability that once, you know, most children in Uganda, you know, were vaccinated with this rubella, with the measles vaccine. So what happens is that they inserted, once it reached your body mounted an immune response that is almost lifetime, okay? So whether you get measles right now, some of you will not even notice because your body has already built that ability to fight it. So what is the issue with the COVID vaccine is that it only has the ability to mount a response only for a short time. Yeah, you know, only for limited periods of times. And these things have been there in the past. I mean, we have influenza vaccines where you find that such a vaccine, let's say in the season, they call up, oh, there is there's this, you know, epidemic that is happening with this influenza. So people get booster shots, you know, to make sure, because the response that has been given is only short-lived. So that is just one issue with it. So now that is what the vaccine is, and that is why, and again I can say we have not science community has not completely, I would say, go to the breadth of how these with this new
Right. Yeah.
natural immunity. You mount a response, you might get
So I asked about whether the boosters are being given too soon, considering the fact that we just had the vaccine. Now we have a booster that's come out, and we're probably going to have another booster coming out. And I know that the CDC is beginning to change the language or the meaning, the definition of vaccinated or fully vaccinated to the third booster.
Yeah.
We probably have a fourth booster coming in another 3 months, but is it practical?
all right.
Is it right? Are people supposed to get these boosters in such a short period of time?
Again, to still go back to the same thing, we're still, you know, understanding you know, like how I've said, when you elicit an immune response and let's say you have antibodies, there are particular measurements to say that once, let's say, you've produced this amount of antibodies that reach, let's say, a titer value, any value, I'm just giving arbitrary value, let's say 30, a level of 30, then I can say, oh, you will never get measles again. Or after this antibody has raised to this value, you'll never get COVID again. But again, that is still in research. We have not yet established the right titer value for an antibody to say that, oh, at this particular titer value of this antibody, you'll never get COVID. So that is why they're having issues of now boosters, because the vaccine that you've taken can only take you up to this time. So now you have to get a booster to elicit another immune response to take you again to another time. And I think one of the questions, another hindrance would be, you know, then does it guarantee that, you know, with all these different variants, that's another issue with mRNA-based vaccines, is that it's producing a protein that you're speculating that this particular protein covers 90% of the viruses there. So then what happens as
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much. Jeffrey, there was a comment somewhere on Twitter, and this person said that they would like some pro-vaccine people to explain why the FDA would wait until the year 2076. I don't know if you saw that piece of information where FDA says they're going to wait till 2076, that's 55 years from now, to fully release its Pfizer vaccine data. Is that even right to do?
Well, that's exactly what's happening. This is a result of a FOIA request, which means freedom of information. But more and more as it relates to vaccines and this whole COVID thing, these freedom of information requests is not getting us information at all. I have a friend who got removed from the VAERS committee at the CDC, which stands for Vaccine Adverse Effects, I don't know, Resource Center, something like that. But he got taken off and so filed a FOIA request to find out why. And it came to him, but it was like 50 pages, but it was all redacted, meaning that it was all blanked out, so you couldn't see it. And the FDA is doing something now with the Pfizer vaccine trial data, which we want to know about because we need to find out whether these vaccines got their emergency use authorization legitimately or not. And there's something like 500,000 pages, and they said they would give something like 500 per month. So it's that puts out 50 years or something until we can see it. But the British Medical Journal also published a big article about possible fraud in the approval process and the vaccine trials of Pfizer. So what happened was we got COVID, then we got the lockdowns, and then everybody said the way to get out of lockdowns is to get a vaccine. So tax dollars were used. All these companies, Moderna and particularly Pfizer, from the German government and the United States government, got billions and billions of dollars to develop these vaccines, and they needed to get them approved right away. So they claimed that they were 94% effective. And that turns out to be a wild exaggeration. I mean, just so that people understand what this means, a lot of the people that were in the trials were not vulnerable to getting vaccinated, getting COVID at all, much less having bad outcomes from it. So, like, if I have a vaccine that can make this apple stop talking, then I give it, and the apple stops talking, then I say that my vaccine works, right? So this is a little bit the way the vaccines were approved. So we need to look at the trial data a little bit more to find out about this. And the same thing is true with boosters. We had two officials with the FDA resign. The top two vaccine safety officials from the FDA resigned their posts about, but I don't know, what was it, 6 months ago or something like that, not even four or 5 months ago, because they knew that we were going to get these boosters approved, and they thought they were being approved without any evidence that that they were actually effective, and for how long. And so they left because they didn't want professional responsibility for this. And then sure enough, the FDA approves them, and now the Biden administration is pushing boosters. And now 2 weeks ago, they said that it was not true that to be fully vaccinated involves a booster. And now 2 weeks later, they're saying you're probably going to have to get a booster in order to be considered fully vaccinated. But I think at this point, honestly, I think people are so tired of this stuff. They got one shot, and then that doesn't protect you. You're still going to get infected, and you're still going to spread it. And then it's even worse than that. You might not know you're sick, so you should be staying home in bed. Instead, you're up and around. You get a second shot, that doesn't protect you. And now it's like a third shot, and and we're not even a year into this. I mean, a booster after not even 1 year. This is not like anything that anybody promised. From the very beginning, all the governments were saying that if you get the vaccine, then you won't get COVID. It turns out that's not true, and in the end, you have to get immunity through natural infection anyway at some point, most likely. And once you get that immunity, then you're not vulnerable and don't need the vaccine. So what's the point of this? What is the point of all this? Is it just profits for drug companies? Is it for the government to get us all on a subscription model so they can investigate our health information and our political loyalties all the time, like in China? I don't know what the goal is, but it's not good medicine.
Right. So speaking about vaccinations still, Korea recently reported that South Korea, that there's an upsurge in COVID cases, despite the fact that about 80 to 90% of their population has been vaccinated. And that's not the only country. There are many other countries, I mean, Israel, one, for example, where they've had a lot of the population vaccinated, and yet they have an uptick in cases. What is really going on?
Yeah, so it's true in Singapore and actually any country with very high vaccination rates. Most countries with very, very high vaccination rates are getting surges in COVID, and that's probably due to waning immunities. It's also possible, I've heard some specialists speculate about this, that the higher the rate of vaccination from the wild type of the virus, the more the mutations take hold in that population. So the virus mutates around the vaccine, and then people get the new variant. That's also possible. It's hard to say because we're not really testing for all these different variants. It's too difficult to test. But what we know for sure now is that the vaccine has no public benefit. It might have a private benefit for older, vulnerable people in terms of prolonging the period of life, but in terms of achieving herd immunity or population immunity, they are not getting the job done. What I would really like to see is some honesty on the part of public health officials now. I'm tired of being lied to. Every single Sunday, Anthony Fauci gets on national television and just says one crazy thing after another. And he never comes to terms with the reality that we're talking about here, that you can read anywhere you want, that all the scientists is talking about. He's completely ignoring the science. We live in strange times where our health officials are just simply not telling us the truth anymore.
Yeah, so I have a few comments coming in, and this was geared towards what Agatha talked about with the media. And we have Eden saying that Agatha is letting the media off the hook quite lightly to say that the media has only one source of information, which is the government, and it's not right. And she says that there are many vocal alternative voices elsewhere. As early as June 2020, a good example where the American frontline doctors and their White Coats summits, these voices were a mere click away all over social media. And he says, but I agree with her that the media feared, and perhaps it has been paid off to peddle one narrative. And if both of these are true, then the media betrayed the public. Instead of being watchdogs, they've become lapdogs for the government. I like that ending. And I think that's so true. Wouldn't you say the same, Mr. Tucker, that the media has become a lapdog?
Oh, it's just pathetic. I mean, I can't. It's been this way since the very beginning, really. It's been so frustrating. I used to love the New York Times, but they have been pushing lockdowns and mandates all along, and then they treat everybody who's against them as they have terrible names for them, right wing or crazy or anti-vax or something like this. They say this every single day. The media has just been miserable throughout, and that's almost all of it. There's just a handful of exceptions, but this is why one of the reasons I founded the Brownstone Institute was just to get the science out there, just to give people an alternative way about thinking about things, because it's not being reported. I think the New York Times only reported on the protests all over the world that's been going on for really the better part of a year. It's really intensified over the weekend. Only just this morning, for the very first time, mentioned that they're going on in Austria. It's not just in Austria, it's all over the world. The press has just been egregious, and I understand it. Like, I talked to some reporters, many reporters, I have friends, and they tell me that they cannot file reports because their editors will not approve them, and they'll just lose their job, or they won't get a promotion or something. So everybody just has to the media is completely influenced by the CDC and by Fauci in particular. He's very careful. When I looked at Fauci's emails from the early days, you could see the Washington Post reporters sending Fauci their articles for him to approve these articles to make sure that he was okay with them. I mean, we have these emails, so we know this has been going on for a very long time.
So, and then we still have more comments coming in. These go to Dr. Carol concerning her comments on the vaccine. And someone said that the vaccine, whatever the vaccine is trying to do, our natural immunity can do if exposed to the virus, and actually it works better. So why should we get the vaccine? And then another person says that should we say that those who are vaccinated, it will be a continuous process of vaccination, because if we say the first hasn't worked, the second hasn't worked, booster hasn't worked, are we going to continuously leave booster to booster? That's another question. And then we have Sauda saying, on a public health standpoint, herd immunity has been taken advantage of to protect those unable to take the vaccine one way or another. For instance, in cases of allergies. However, in this case, the non-vaccinated are blamed for variants and spread as well. Interestingly, the research done in Israel reports contrary. It says that natural immunity is better and longer than a vaccine. My worry is our national scientists that advise the president don't seem to find these facts. One question that we have about 9 minutes to the close is, what could be a solution to what could be a solution that we have now that we're pretty much about 2 years in with COVID? What's the reality? What's the actual reality? And what should we be doing going forward? I'll start with Taka.
I think the reality of COVID right now is that it's already reaching an endemic equilibrium in most parts of the world, unless we get these mass vaccination campaigns and boosters, and then who knows what kind of mutations we're going to have. The biggest problem we have in health right now is not COVID, but it's cancer and depression and terror and obesity and bad health in general as a result of the lockdowns, and drug overdoses and alcoholism. And this is what we need to be really caring about right now. I get really tired of it because when you go to the doctor now, all they care about is COVID. But actually, people have a lot of sicknesses, and more sicknesses than ever now that we've been staying indoors and staying away from people where our immune systems have been degraded. So we've got a health crisis right now. We've got an economic crisis with supply chains breaking, inflation. We've got people in the United States and all over the world that this winter are going to have to choose between feeding their children and heating their homes because of this problem. This is very, very serious. These are the things we need to think about for the future. And as for these boosters, I mean, anybody who thinks that you're going to be getting a new booster every 3 months or 6 months and you're willing to go along with that, I question people's commitment to their own sanity and freedom, because that's not the way anybody should ever allow themselves to be lived. Just the government telling you what kind of thing to inject into your body on a regular basis and giving you a card to prove it. It's disgusting. That is not freedom. So I'd like to see us get back to the principles of good public health, freedom, human rights, and we need systems that prevent these people from ever doing this to us ever again. We cannot allow lockdowns and these kinds of mandates to ever take place again. I think if we all work and come together all over the world and say no to the governments and to the big pharmaceutical companies and to the tech censors and to the media that's been distorting the truth, we have to say no to all these people, lift our voices, get out, let the truth be heard, let it be known. And I think we have a real hope of fixing this. It's going to take a very long time, but but as far as I'm concerned, freedom and human rights are non-negotiable. We have to have them. Democracy, freedom, and human rights are the way that we live our lives and the way we find progress and dignity as human beings. And we cannot ever again allow them to take that away from us.
That's true. Claire says, from Dr. Kara's submission, I feel it's clear that the idea of not opening schools and churches on grounds of vaccination is a lame excuse. Natural immunity seems to be a better alternative than the vaccine whose boost is temporal. Let governments just end lockdowns. Brian says it is necessary to wear, is it necessary to wear masks and social distance anymore, given that vaccines are available now? Well, that's a question. And again, my question goes out, what could be a solution now that we're pretty much 2 years in with COVID? What's the reality and what should we be doing going forward? And I will ask Simon to respond to that. 1 minute, please.
All right. I think the way forward is for us to take a firm stand against the whole globalist notion of blanket lockdown measures or blanket COVID-19, curbing measures, the lockdowns, the mandatory vaccinations, but most importantly for me is the resistance against the infringement against the freedom of assembly, which also goes together with the freedom of worship. I think that is the core of humanity, at least that's the core of the African society. The ability and the opportunity for us to gather together as a people, for us to demonstrate our love, our ambition, our perspective towards humanity through gathering. So the places of worship ought to be opened unconditionally. In Uganda, we have filed 3 cases in the High Court, in the Constitutional Court, and the East African Court of Justice. I think every Ugandan, every African, every person on the face of the earth needs to pick interest in some of these legal battles, because they're not only shaping the discussion for the moment, but they're shaping the discussion that is going to, that's going to be our cornerstone, even in the future when such pandemics show up. But finally, I think this is the time for us to reflect on the values which we hold true and dear. Especially for us as a nation in Uganda, we hold true and dear the essence of the godly values, the omnipotence of God. And that is what should be our guiding factor. A person who really honestly fears God and respects God will not go ahead to want to destroy people's lives, will not go ahead to lock down people unconditionally, will not want to introduce dangerous vaccines into their lives. I think it's time for us to make serious reflection, not only as the leaders, but also as the citizens, introspectively, to realize that this is a discussion that matters for us as a nation, and everybody needs to be a part of this. But above all, let your voice count. Stand up, raise up, and realize that your voice is not simply a lone voice in the desert. The moment we can get all our voices combined together, there is no government which can stand. Let us take the best practices. I would love to look at nations like Sweden, which never went for the lockdowns. I would have said Kenya, which has opened up, but recently, Taka, your Secretary of State, over the weekend, I think, visited Kenya, and after he left, Kenya has now imposed mandatory vaccination on all the citizens. So I don't think some of these people should, I think, be kept away. So in Uganda, Fauci has multiplied into 2 people. We have the Ministry of Health, the Minister of Health, and the permanent, actually 3. He has, you talk about in your book how Jesus was quarantined and the Trinity. So you're having here the multiplication of evil in 3 perspectives with the Minister of Health, the Permanent Secretary of Health, and the Minister of Information and Technology, Dr. Musenero. In Uganda today, I just need to make this point. Dr. Musenero right now is before a parliamentary committee, a select parliamentary committee, where she's being accused of misappropriating monies that were meant to develop a vaccine in Uganda. So the reflections we need to make is that people like Fauci and all those who appear in any form and substance like him need to be dealt with squarely, legally, and we need to push them out of office. So the prayers, Taka, you're making for the USA are the prayers that we need this side. But I think much more the people that you're having from your side who are coming in Africa and disorganizing the nations this side need to be kept away. They need to be, as in terror, you need to flee away from them. But thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Simon. Quickly, so we literally have 2 minutes, and I'm going to ask Dr. Kara to summarize what's the reality and what are we going to do better going forward as a medical doctor, as the medical community?
I think what we really need to advocate for is there's this whole notion again that most of our health recommendations are things that are us move forward. And yeah, blessings.
Thank you so much. So finally, Agatha, what's we're 2 years in with COVID. What's the reality? What are we doing? What should we do going forward? Just 30 seconds.
Okay, if I have 30 seconds, can I clarify on the issue that Eden asked me about? I think when I said once, if I said one source of information, it wasn't literal. It was to mean that the government controlled the narrative, both here and in other countries, actually. And I'm glad when Jeffrey mentions New York Times and stuff. It was, we were, the fear that was instilled in us, the fear of COVID itself that we didn't know anything about, and the fear of our governments here. Mm-hmm. But of course, so many times when we had an opportunity to voice our opinions, journalism in Uganda is practiced differently. We are supposed to only say what other people are saying. Yeah. If you wrote and said, because of this and this, we don't need a lockdown, your editor would say, don't write your opinion. And I've always had a problem with that we can quote everyone else, but not the information we have ourselves. Now, while other subjects, you have civil society, opposition, everyone weighing in on this particular COVID-19 subject, it was only hearing from President Museveni every so often, and the Ministry of Health. That is what I meant. But going forward, I think we should learn to live with it. It has already caused us enough harm. Mm-hmm. That's what I think. Yes.
Thank you so much. And this has been the 7th Budget Town Hall meeting with this title From Lockdowns to Liberty, Debunking Myths, Interrogating the Science, the Place of Human Rights and Freedoms Post-COVID-19. And as Jeffrey, I'll end with what Jeffrey Tucker said, and which Ken also commented, and I thought was a profound statement, that freedoms and human rights are non-negotiable. And that is extremely true. Thank you so much for being a part of the discussion. And this discussion is definitely not going anywhere else. We're going to have more panelists coming in, and we're going to keep talking about this until the world has woken up to the fact that COVID-19 is here to stay, and we just need to brace ourselves, move forward, and enjoy our freedoms. Thank you. Have a good one. Bye.